Hello, and welcome back to Human Geography. Today, we want to talk a little bit about urban land use. What are the parts of the city, and why are they located where they are? So, really quickly, I just want to break the city down into the central business district, downtown, the suburbs, that's going to be around the central business district. The metropolitan area is going to be everything that has to do with the city. And then a megalopolis, we've talked about a little bit. That's when metropolitan areas grow until they meet each other, and DFW, where we live, is a really good example of that. The corridor, the Bowash corridor, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. is another really good example of that. First, let's ask your first question. The area of the central city, marked by high land values, a concentration of businesses and commerce, and the clustering of the tallest buildings, is the economic base, central business district, basic sector, or a suburb? Well, it's the central business district, and that's what we want to start with. This is usually going to be the heart of the city where it was originally settled, okay? And it is centrally located because the settlement grew around it. And I've put in here for each of these kind of a list of typical businesses. Different downtowns have different amounts of each of these, but they're all going to have some. Maybe not everything, but most of them. Okay, then we have the inner city. This is going to be the area that's just outside the central business district. The housing, these were built for factory workers, right? So the workers could get to work easily, walk. Usually they're terraced houses for the faculty workers, but they may be replaced by high-rise flats. There's a lot of renovation that goes on in these. You'll also find small corner shops as opposed to large grocery stores. Now, in terms of the modern inner city, it's changed since obviously when it was built. Land is more scarce because you can't just build more things in locations. I mean, it's all filled up. It's surrounded by suburbs and exurbi and all that. So land is much more expensive, and that means there's going to be competitive bidding for land. And we're going to talk about that later. That has to do with the bid rent stuff. It is cheaper to build up in this case than it is to build out because you're building on top of whatever you're doing. The outlying areas do, on the other hand, become relatively cheap. However, when you have the inner city residents who tend to be poorer, they really can't afford the transportation. And so we're going to talk all about what happens to inner cities when you have the growth of suburbs. But it's called urban decay, and here's just a little preview, but we're going to spend a whole day talking about urban decay a little bit later on, not in this unit. All right, so the inner suburbs, these are going to be the houses. They were typically built in the 1920s to the 1950s. They're outside the inner city. They're the first of the suburbs. It is where you go to school, right, in the inner suburbs. It becomes part of the modern city as the city grows. You'll find that there are larger houses, typically with gardens. They're newer, built for a growing population. Land was cheaper. It's probably more expensive now because it's part of the modern city. You'll have some parks, some shops, things like that. Then you move into the outer suburbs, and this is going to be your modern housing. These are going to be the new houses. Sometimes they're really close together, as you can see in this picture. Sometimes they have lawns, sometimes they don't. But basically you have cheap land, and there's enough space to build large houses, oftentimes with yards. You also have large spaces to put shopping centers, strip malls, stuff like that. Okay, and then just to give you an idea, let's look at Atlanta from 1990 to 2000, because this was a time of big growth. You see the change in population, lots of movement outwards, and we'll come back to Atlanta when we talk about urban decay. But that is because you have shift in employment, okay? And so as people are coming in, well, companies are going to be the same as people. They're going to have to pay rent, or they're going to have to pay a mortgage, and they're going to want to spend less money on that. And less money means out. And so we're really talking about our beginning conversation about urban sprawl. All right, then we have exurbia. These are the areas outside the major metropolitan area, but they're still within the commuter shed, which means that people can often live out here and then drive in anywhere from 10 to 50 miles from urban centers, for cities of approximately 500,000. And if you think about it, Dallas is like almost 1.5 million, so we're going to be closer to the 50-mile range. Commuters will typically travel at least 30 minutes, although sometimes it's up to 2 hours, and especially when you throw in traffic. Okay, I just like this picture. And then this actually is Aubrey, which is just outside of Denton, and it's still very much kind of rural. You can see there's some subdivisions coming in and stuff. But this is a pretty far drive. I mean, it's going to be an hour or more into downtown. Actually, more than that, over an hour to downtown. So you're going to see a mix of urban and rural land uses. And it'll be a low density, but it's a very short period of time before it becomes higher density, and we'll talk about that too. Okay. Now, in most cities, you have older industrial areas. This is where the factories used to be. They're usually along a river, a canal, or a railway. Many of the old factories have closed down. The area may look run down, although a lot of cities are going back in and trying to renovate these areas into like shopping districts and tourist, oh, for goodness sake, shopping districts and tourist areas and things like that. Cannery Row in San Francisco is a really good example. We've done a little work on ours here in Dallas, but it's coming along. All right, newer industrial areas, these are typically going to be further out. These are the ones that are built since the 70s, and as opposed to being close to a river or a rail, they're going to be close to main roads for trucking. So what factors affect land use? This is a really good question. Well, land value is going to be an important thing because, I mean, you're going to have to make money in order to buy expensive land. There's always zoning, right? And technology, right? What's available? You can work farther out if you can telecommute, for instance. Climate matters, and we'll talk about that not today, but more later on. And cities in the poorer parts of the world usually lack enforceable laws to ensure orderly space, and these laws, again, are called what? That's right, zoning laws. That's just a little review. Zoning is really important, and so areas can be zoned to be residential, commercial, mixed, industrial, whatever, okay? All right, now land use patterns. Who's doing what and where? So almost 80% of people live, work, travel, shop, spend leisure time, blah, 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 in cities, okay? So cities have to have the infrastructure to make sure that they can supply all of these services. And so when you start looking at what are those services, you're going to have the public buildings, right? Institutional buildings, open space, recreational areas, houses, residential or apartments, transportation, roads, public transportation, whatever, industrial stuff, whatever that may be, and commercial stuff. And we're going to define all that in a minute. All right, so residential land use, this is where the people actually live, and it takes up about 40% of the developed land. The residential density is going to be affected by two factors, the value of the land and the age of the development. The older the development, oftentimes the more concentrated it is. Having said that, a lot of modern suburbs are really high density as well, and you can see by this. And then, of course, apartments, new or old, are going to be high density. Okay, transportation use. About a third of the land in most cities is taken up by roads and highways. This is our very own High Five exchange here in Dallas, and you can see it's a lot of road. And then 5% or so of cities are going to be for commercial activities, and these are also both locations here in Dallas. And this is where you're going to buy and sell goods and services. And then there are really 5 main types of commercial use, and that's going to be your local service centers. Those are going to be convenience stores. Here's a lovely 7-Eleven, also here. Neighborhood plazas and ribbons. Those are going to be your strip malls. Community shopping centers, that's like Willow Bend, right? Regional shopping centers, that would be North Park for us. And then the central business district is always downtown. Now, public service land use. This is going to be your institutional and public buildings. They take about 10% of the land, and that's going to include schools, hospitals, government buildings, and churches. And then open space and recreation land, this is like parks and stuff. And that's going to be about 7% of land inside cities. Some cities have a higher percentage of that. Some cities have lower. Unfortunately, Dallas is a little bit on the lower side for that one. Some cities have more, and it'd be nice if we could have more too. All right, so what about industrial land use? This is about 6% of land use in most cities, okay? There are 4 types of industrial land use, and that is, wow, 4 types of industrial land use types. That's great. Anyway, go with it. All right, suburban business parks, suburban industrial parks, central business districts, and ribbon industries, okay? And ribbon industries are going to be something we're going to talk about a little bit more later on. But essentially, you're talking about a belt of connected industries. Okay, so that brings us to Weber's least cost theory. Why are all of these things where they are? Now, Alfred Weber formulated a theory about industrial location, and basically you put something where you can minimize its cost and maximize its profits. That makes total sense. There are three categories of costs that have to be taken into account: transportation, labor, and agglomeration. And transportation obviously is going to be getting stuff places, and that's really two things. You have to move raw materials to your factory, so you want to be somewhere relatively close to the source. Hopefully, you also want to take your finished products to the market, so you also want to be close to the market, and those are two opposite factors, right? Labor. This is going to be what you pay, right? And so a factory might do better farther from raw materials if it has cheap labor, or it might do better closer to raw materials if it's expensive labor, right? So you have to balance that. And then agglomeration is when you have a large number of things clustering in the same area. They can actually provide assistance to each other, right? They can support each other. And so here's a really good example. If you have a manufacturing plant or if you have a software center, you're also going to need office furniture. And so an office furniture place might want to be close to some other services. So you'll get clusters of industry together, okay, hopefully. And we'll come back to this. We're going to work with this. You're going to do a little industrial planning yourself. All right. So the structure of cities. Cities can vary depending on all sorts of things, but there are four basic models of internal patterns, and we'll talk about these and a little bit some other things too. There are social factors going to be at play, the government itself, right, zoning laws, all of that stuff, and then environmental concerns are also going to be part of that. And by environmental concerns, I don't necessarily mean, environmental issues like pollution or things like that. I mean, like, what is the actual site and situation of your city, okay? But basically, these models of urban systems have been developed to help not only explain but predict the internal structures of cities. And so how is this going to grow? What's going to happen, right? And different models really stress different things, okay? In most cases, no city actually fits just one model, especially in modern times, right? But the oldest model and the most basic is the concentric zone model. This is also called the Burgess land use model. And basically, it says that land use can be explained with these rings, right? And we actually have seen this when we looked at agriculture. And so this actually matches, right, that idea of where you're going to grow things in relation to the central business district, okay? So I want you to go back and I want you to compare what we learned about in agriculture to what we're learning here. Now, the pattern is going to be based on oftentimes what's called a bid-rent curve that I mentioned earlier, and that's going to predict the land prices and the population density, and both of those are going to decline as you move away from the central business district. But basically, you get a central business district, you get a zone of transition, okay, and that's going to be immediately adjacent, and this is where you have industries, right? You have all of those kinds of, wow, I totally just lost my train of thought. Sorry, you have industrial activities, right? Your transportation stuff, that's going to go on there. And then you're going to move into your zone of independent workers. And this is, of course, where you're going to have workers living. And then you're going to move out and you get better residences. And then outside of that is going to be the commuter zone, okay? Now, this is a process of expansion and reconversion of land use. However, it's really simple, and it's only limited to, or it is limited to cities prior to the 1950s. Once you hit the 1950s, we have a shift in what's going on. And so we have a lot of changes. It was developed for American cities, and so it really doesn't apply a whole lot of other places. But it gave us the basis to sort of develop all of these other models, okay, like the sector model. And this was developed in the 30s. And it's a modification of the concentric pattern, and it's based on the idea that land use zones are going to be adjacent to transportation routes, okay? And so it's going to imply that factories and industrial activities are always going to follow those transportation routes, as does lower socioeconomic housing, by the way, in this. Okay, so here you still have your central business district, then you have your transportation industry. This could be a river, a road, whatever. Then you have your low class residential, okay, which is going to be here and here, again adjacent to the factories. Then you're going to have your middle class, which is on the other side of that, and then you'll have your high class, which is going to be in sort of a linear pattern that's split right between the middle class sections. So you actually have 3 middle class sections there. Okay. Now moving on, that was great, but then things started to shift again, and so the multiple nuclei model was developed. And this was developed for cities where you didn't have a concentric or sector model. And so it's the idea that growth is going to occur independently around focal points, right? Whatever those may be, transportation hubs, universities, whatever, okay? And so this actually shifts the focus away from the central business district. And this is where you start really accounting for suburbs, right? And so when you look at this, you've got your central business district, right? But then you have all sorts of residential areas, but you've got heavy manufacturing over here. Maybe there's a railway. You've got wholesale light manufacturing. Maybe you've got roads, whatever. You're going to have these different areas, okay? Nuclei, that's why it's called that. All right. Now, as you move away from all of that and you start really developing suburbs, because between the 1940s and the 1970s, right, we see a huge economic boom and the car, right? And so you have this idea of suburban regions really kind of becoming their own little realms and they have fixed activity spaces, and people can spend almost all of their time and their activities, doing their activities in this little realm, this fixed activity space, okay? And you also have this, at the same time, feeling of wanting to move out of the city. That's called counter-urbanization. And so, that's great. It also helps that people can telecommute now, right? So they can log on and do all of their work from their house, and that's great. So what you end up getting is still you have your central city, okay, and you have your central business district, but you start developing new downtowns where these edge areas kind of overlap, right? And so you may have a little center here, you may have a little center here, you may have a little center here, and people still drive in. I mean, think about our models about the relationships of cities and services and things like that. But all of those models were made for American cities, and it turns out that cities in developing nations don't really follow the same model. And so in the 80s, people got together and started to describe this very predictable nature of Latin American cities, which is called the Latin American model. And they're very unique, and they're all over Central and South America. When you start talking about these large cities, is kind of the way they look. They have a core central business district, which is consistent with some of the other models, but they have a commercial spine, this kind of corridor of commercial stuff, and that is because there's infrastructure there where there may not be anywhere else. So they're gonna cluster around that infrastructure, and then you'll have elite neighborhoods that'll actually surround that commercial spine, and they'll usually have large green spaces, but mostly they're there because that's where all the amenities are. Yeah. Now that core structure is going to be surrounded by concentric rings of residential areas. Those areas are going to decrease in value with distance from the CBD. Now, often, and especially as you go farther out, infrastructure is flaky at best, and in many places it is completely lacking. All right. Let's see if I can get your next question. Here we go. Nope. There we go. All right, the outer ring in both Latin American cities and Southeast Asian cities are usually the place where markets are found, industrial areas, slums and squatter settlements, or the rich. Well, if you're farther away from the CBD, you're less likely to have any sort of infrastructure at all, and so this is where you find your slums and your squatter settlements. They'll be in the periphery of these sorts of things. And so you can see here you have your peripheral squatter settlements. You do have industrial, but then you also have that channel right towards the market, and the market's actually going to be with the central business district. There's that commercial spine, shopping, all that good stuff, elite neighborhoods. Okay, so there you go. All right. Now, modern cities are changing. Yeah. Originally, cities were based on manufacturing and industrialization, but post industrial cities oftentimes have economies that are based more on consumption, right? Conspicuous consumption is actually what that's called. And so, this is what I was talking about redoing industrial parks into more touristy, um, more kind of elite areas. Now, one of the things that you can see in modern cities is postmodernism, which started out, as we know, when we talked about folk housing, as an architectural style that emphasizes like a free form kind of situation. Now, interestingly enough, this becomes a school of thought and becomes incorporated into cultural attitudes. And just as a side note, there are actually lots and lots of different thought processes that go with the idea of postmodernism being a good thing or postmodernism thought processes being a bad thing. That is not actually a conversation we're going to have, but I wanted you to be aware of it because I think it's very interesting and you might too. All right. Now, the other thing is that deindustrialization is really becoming popular in major modern cities. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about urban decay again. But there are a couple of really big problems that I just want to point out right now, and that is that it makes U.S. cities dependent on foreign imports if you are not making things, right? If you're not making them, you have to get them from somebody who is, and we'll talk about that when we talk about trade. And then modern cities, because they're diversifying, as we've talked about earlier in this unit, the not industries, but the jobs that are available become more skilled jobs. And so they most of the time require education and an understanding of technology. And this leaves many people without the necessary skills, and they are unemployed, which leads to an increased crime rate. And so you have in cities that don't have good jobs available for people, increased crime. Yeah. And this whole education thing, this is one of the reasons that education is so amazingly important. Higher technology jobs, right, are the jobs that are becoming the norm, right? And so if you don't have skills, if you do not have an education, you will get left behind. And that is a very serious thing. And it's something that you are going to have to look at as you get older and when you're starting to make decisions about the way that you want things to go for us. Yeah. So anyway, that's it. If you have any questions, please let me know at the beginning of class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.